Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that unelected bureaucrats, people most Europeans couldn't name if you asked them on the street, just tried to reshape the future of global free speech with a single decision. Not through democratic debate, not through a vote, not through public conversation where citizens could weigh in, but with a punishment exceeding $140 million aimed at forcing one platform to hand over unprecedented user data and quietly censor political speech they don't approve of. And here is what they didn't anticipate. The blowback was immediate, the ripple effect was global, and the reaction inside Europe wasn't just anger. It was awakening, because what the European Commission thought would be a routine assertion of regulatory authority became something entirely different. It became the catalyst that exposed the entire censorship infrastructure they'd been building for years. And once exposed, once millions of Europeans could actually see what was happening, the dynamic shifted in ways Brussels never imagined possible. So let me walk you through what actually happened, because the details matter enormously here. The European Commission issued a fine somewhere between $120 and $140 million against X, the social media platform. Now, you might think companies get fined all the time for breaking rules. That is how regulation works. But this fine was fundamentally different. This wasn't about a safety violation or a data breach or some technical failure. This was about refusal to share detailed identity information about users, refusal to hand over control of who gets verified and who doesn't, and most importantly, refusal to quietly censor political speech the Commission found inconvenient. Think about that structure for a moment. The penalty wasn't tied to harm caused. It was tied to non-compliance with demands that would fundamentally change how information flows on the platform. And the Commission's official explanation was wrapped in language about transparency regulations and digital safety acts. They said the blue verification checkmark was deceptive because anyone could pay for it. They claimed the platform wasn't providing adequate access to researchers who wanted to study misinformation. But let's decode what those words actually mean in practice. When they talk about transparency, they're really talking about access. Access to who is saying what, access to private user information, access that would allow government-aligned groups to identify, track, and pressure individuals who post things the establishment finds uncomfortable. And when they talk about misinformation, they mean information that contradicts official narratives, whether those narratives are about migration, energy policy, or political candidates. This isn't speculation. We know from the timeline that the EU began aggressively auditing the platform shortly after it was purchased and transformed into a space where diverse political opinions, including conservative and populist voices, could actually be heard without instant suppression. Within months, warning letters arrived. Then came charges about letting disinformation run wild. Then an attempt to block a live interview with a presidential candidate during an election. Each step was escalation. Each step was pressure. And each step revealed that the real issue wasn't safety or transparency. The real issue was loss of control over the public conversation. So why is the European Union suddenly so aggressive about this? Because something remarkable has been happening on the ground across Europe. For decades, most Europeans got their news from a relatively small number of sources: state broadcasters, legacy newspapers, outlets that, whether intentionally or not, tended to align with the priorities of political elites. But over the past few years, millions of Europeans have started getting their news from platforms where information isn't filtered through political gatekeepers. In somewhere between 10 and 15 European countries, X has become the #1 news app. That means every single day, more people in those countries are opening an app where they can see unfiltered commentary, raw debate, perspectives that would never make it onto evening news. And this terrifies institutional leadership, because for the first time in decades, their narrative monopoly is disappearing. Now let's talk about the 2-year campaign that led to this moment, because understanding the pattern is crucial to understanding what this fine really represents. The pressure didn't start with this penalty. It started almost immediately after the platform changed hands and the editorial approach shifted. In summer 2023, the European Union conducted an audit and flagged the platform for not properly handling hate speech and disinformation. 5 months later, they issued a formal warning letter claiming the platform wasn't stopping the spread of misinformation. Then, during the height of the American presidential election, they charged the platform with letting disinformation run wild, specifically pointing to pro-Trump rhetoric, as if supporting a presidential candidate is somehow grounds for regulatory action. 1 month after that, they tried to prohibit a live conversation between two American citizens. Just think about that for a moment. A foreign governmental body attempting to interfere in American political discourse by blocking a conversation. Then, after the election was over and a new administration was coming into power, the EU ramped up its investigation, clearly trying to build a legal case that would finally bring the platform to heel. And now here we are. A fine exceeding $100 million, an unprecedented penalty designed to send a message. Comply or pay. But something remarkable happened in response. Instead of compliance, there was resistance. Instead of silence, there was amplification. And instead of Europeans nodding along and accepting the official narrative, millions of them started asking questions. Why is our government so focused on controlling what we can read? Why are they more concerned about online speech than about the issues we actually care about, like migration, energy costs, and economic stagnation? And why are unelected officials in Brussels making decisions that affect our daily lives without ever asking for our input? These aren't radical questions. These are the questions ordinary people ask when they realize the system isn't serving them. And the EU's aggressive move against the platform isn't suppressing those questions, it is amplifying them. Hashtags calling for reform, or even abolition of the European Union, are starting to trend. Support for free speech candidates is surging. And across multiple countries, citizens who've never been particularly political are speaking out, not because they love the platform necessarily, but because they recognize what is at stake. This is what happens when you try to control speech in the digital age. You don't silence people, you radicalize them. You don't shut down debate. You drive it underground where it becomes angrier, more conspiratorial, and far harder to influence. The EU thought a massive fine would assert authority. Instead, it revealed weakness. It showed that the Commission fears open conversation more than it fears public backlash. And once people see that fear, once they realize their government is afraid of what they might say, the dynamic shifts entirely. Which brings us to the American reaction, because this didn't just stay a European story. Within hours of the fine being announced, American officials started responding. The Secretary of State called it an attack, not just on one platform, but on all American tech companies and the American people. The U.S. ambassador to the European Union said the fine was the result of regulatory overreach targeting American innovation, and made clear the Trump administration would challenge burdensome regulations aimed at U.S. companies abroad. An Undersecretary of State went even further, calling the Digital Safety Act a blunt instrument of political control and financial extortion, arguing that the people most hurt by these punitive fines are everyday European citizens, because the fines kill investment, crush business confidence, and drive innovators away. And then came the policy response that changed everything. The United States government officially decided to stop issuing and renewing visas for European citizens who work in censorship-related fields. That includes people involved in fact-checking, content moderation, trust and safety, or anything related to combating so-called misinformation or disinformation. The message was clear and unambiguous. If you are working to censor Americans, you are not welcome in America. Now this dynamic should feel familiar, because we've seen this movie before. During the Cold War, the United States spent enormous sums defending Europe from Soviet aggression. We stationed troops, funded military alliances, essentially underwrote European security for decades. And we did that because we believed Europe shared our values: freedom of speech, democratic accountability, rule of law. But what happens when Europe stops sharing those values? What happens when the same continent we're defending starts fining our companies for refusing to censor our citizens? That is the contradiction at the heart of this entire situation. America spends somewhere around $50 billion every year helping ensure European stability and regional defense, all at the cost of American taxpayers. And in return, Europe uses regulatory power to punish American innovation and undermine American principles. It is not a sustainable partnership, and the Trump administration's response makes clear the days of pretending otherwise are over. But here is the deeper point that really matters for understanding where this is heading. The fine isn't silencing anyone, it is activating them. Across Europe, people are flocking to the very platform the EU tried to punish. They're joining not because they necessarily agree with every post or every user, but because they recognize that a space where you can speak freely is rare and valuable. And once you experience that freedom, once you see what open conversation actually looks like, it is very hard to go back to environments where every word is monitored and every opinion is filtered. This brings us to something much bigger than fines or regulations or even individual platforms. This is about Europe itself and the civilizational crossroads it is facing right now. Because the debate over this fine isn't really about data transparency or blue check marks. It is about European identity. It is about sovereignty. It is about whether the nations that gave birth to Western civilization can survive the decisions their leaders have been making for the past several decades. If you talk to everyday Europeans, not politicians or bureaucrats or academic elites, but regular people in towns and cities across the continent, you'll hear the same concerns repeatedly. They're worried about migration, not because they're hateful or close-minded, but because they've watched neighborhoods transform almost overnight. They've seen schools overwhelmed. They've witnessed crime patterns shift. They've felt cultural traditions marginalized in the name of inclusion. And when they try to talk about these concerns publicly, they're told they're spreading hate speech. They're worried about economic stagnation. Energy costs have skyrocketed because of policies that shut down reliable power plants in favor of sources that can't meet demand. Businesses are leaving because regulatory burden makes profitable operation nearly impossible. Young people can't find work. Retirement systems are straining under demographic pressures. And yet when citizens try to debate these issues, when they question whether the green transition is being managed competently, or whether mass migration is economically sustainable, they're accused of spreading misinformation. They're worried about democratic accountability. They watch as decisions that fundamentally reshape their countries get made by people they never elected and can't remove from office. They see the European Commission override national referendums. They watch as concerns raised by millions of voters get dismissed as populism or nationalism, as if caring about your own country's future is somehow morally suspect. And when they find spaces online where these frustrations can actually be voiced, where they can connect with others who share their concerns, suddenly those spaces become targets for regulatory crackdown. This is what the fine is really about. It is not about making the internet safer. It is about keeping a lid on conversations the establishment doesn't want to happen. Because those conversations are dangerous. Not dangerous to public safety, but dangerous to political stability. Dangerous to the narrative that everything is fine, that experts have it all under control, that ordinary citizens should just trust the process and stop asking inconvenient questions. The problem is the lid doesn't fit anymore. The pressure has been building too long, and attempts to force it back down only make the eventual explosion more dramatic. Inside Europe, something remarkable has been happening over the past few years. There has been an awakening. Country after country has seen the rise of political parties and movements that the media labels far-right, but which are really just advocating for what would have been considered mainstream common sense a generation ago. Controlled borders, national sovereignty, free speech, democratic accountability, preservation of cultural identity. These aren't radical positions. They're conservative in the truest sense of the word. They seek to conserve things of value that are being lost. And the fine is accelerating this awakening because it makes visible what was previously invisible. It is showing ordinary Europeans that their concerns aren't being ignored by accident. They're being suppressed on purpose. The platform where they were finally able to speak freely, where they could share articles their newspapers wouldn't publish, and videos their broadcasters wouldn't air, where they could organize and mobilize and push back against policies they disagreed with. that platform just got hit with a massive penalty, specifically for refusing to help silence them. The response has been powerful. Hashtags calling for abolition of the European Union are trending across the continent. Think about that. Not reform, not restructuring, abolition. People are arguing that the entire project has become so disconnected from democratic principles that it should be dismantled entirely, with sovereignty returned to individual nations, so governments can actually represent their people. Now, whether that is realistic or desirable is a separate question, but the fact that millions of Europeans are even having that conversation tells you how deep the frustration runs. Support for free speech candidates is surging. Parties that campaign explicitly on protecting freedom of expression, on resisting censorship, on opposing the Digital Safety Act and similar regulations, are gaining ground in poll after poll. And crucially, this isn't just young people or political activists. It is across demographics. Seniors, middle-aged parents, small business owners, people who never thought of themselves as particularly political, but who recognize that something fundamental is at stake. Which raises an interesting question. What happens if major platforms decide Europe isn't worth the trouble anymore? What happens if the regulatory burden, the constant threat of massive fines, the pressure to implement censorship systems that violate the principles the platforms were built on? What if all of that becomes too costly? You might think platforms need European users. They'd never walk away from a market of hundreds of millions of people. But here's the thing. Europe doesn't build these platforms. Europe doesn't innovate in this space. What Europe does is regulate platforms built elsewhere, primarily in America, and use the threat of market access to force compliance with rules that would never pass in countries with strong free speech protections. So if a platform calculates that operating in Europe requires abandoning its core principles, that the only way to avoid crippling fines is to become an arm of state censorship, then leaving becomes a rational choice. And if that happens, who loses? It is not the platform. It is European citizens who get cut off from global conversations, trapped inside information bubbles, controlled by their governments, who lose access to the digital public square. Section 5. The miscalculations and what comes next. 500 words. So what is the European Union miscalculating? They're making several critical errors, and understanding them helps explain why this is backfiring so spectacularly. First, they assumed a massive fine would force compliance. They believed the threat of financial pain would be enough to bring the platform to heel, to make it accept oversight, to turn it into just another regulated utility that processes information according to approved guidelines. But they misjudged both the financial resources available to resist and the reputational value of being seen as the platform that wouldn't bend. Second, they assumed Europeans would side with their government over a foreign platform. They thought citizens would see the fine as protecting them from misinformation and hate speech, that they'd appreciate the Commission standing up to big tech. But that is not what is happening. Instead, millions of Europeans are seeing the fine as confirmation of what they'd already suspected, that their government fears open conversation more than any external threat. And rather than applauding the Commission, they're questioning its legitimacy. Third, they assumed the United States would stay out of it. They thought this was a regulatory matter between the EU and a private company, that American officials might issue pro forma statements of concern, but wouldn't take concrete action. But they were wrong. The response from the Trump administration was immediate and substantive. Visa restrictions for censorship workers. Public statements framing the fine as an attack on American citizens. Clear signals that the days of quietly accepting European regulatory overreach are over. This is turning what the EU thought would be a contained regional issue into an international incident with serious diplomatic implications. Fourth, they assumed controlling one platform would be enough to control the conversation. But that is not how information works anymore. When you crack down on one space, people don't just give up and go home. They find other spaces. They build new platforms. They create workarounds. And every act of censorship, every fine, every attempt at control, it teaches people to be more resourceful, more determined, more committed to preserving spaces where they can speak freely. And finally, they're miscalculating the historical moment. 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, this strategy might have worked. People were less aware of how content moderation actually functioned. They trusted institutions more. They were less connected to alternative information sources. But we're living in a different era now. People have watched too many narratives collapse. They've seen too many things, labeled misinformation, turn out to be true. They've witnessed too many experts be wrong about too many important things. Trust in institutions is at historic lows, not because of foreign interference or conspiracy theories, but because institutions have repeatedly shown themselves to be incompetent, corrupt, or both. So when the European Commission says they're finding a platform to protect citizens from misinformation, people don't automatically believe that anymore. They ask who decides what counts as misinformation. They ask what if the official narrative is wrong. They ask why are you so afraid of letting us make up our own minds? And those questions, once asked widely enough, loudly enough, persistently enough, they change everything. The European Union issued what they thought was a routine fine. What they actually did was expose the entire architecture of digital censorship they'd been building for years. They revealed their priorities. They showed their hand. And in doing so, they triggered exactly the kind of public awakening they were trying to prevent. So here's what this all means going forward. The EU's $140 million mistake wasn't the fine itself. It was the assumption that power and intimidation would be enough to control how people communicate. That assumption is being tested right now in real time, and it is failing the test. More Europeans are seeking uncensored platforms than ever before. More Americans are questioning why we're allied with governments that don't share our commitment to free expression. More people everywhere are recognizing that the fight over online speech is really a fight over whether we'll live in free societies or managed ones. And the biggest lesson, the one that matters most, is this. Attempts to control speech in the digital age almost always backfire, because the harder you squeeze, the more determined people become to find spaces you can't reach. The more you punish platforms for hosting dissent, the more valuable those platforms become. The more you insist that only approved narratives can be shared, the more people question what you are trying to hide. This isn't just about one platform, or one fine, or one regulatory battle. It is about whether we're going to preserve spaces where ordinary people can speak freely, debate honestly, and challenge power without fear. That is worth fighting for. That is worth understanding. And that is what millions of Europeans are waking up to realize right now.